Imagine we're back in 2020 when the COVID-19 pandemic was just beginning. Your adult child with Down syndrome has contracted the virus and her oxygen levels are dropping, so in an effort to follow medical advice, you take her to the emergency room. You're assured you'll be allowed to stay with your child despite the strict protocols the hospital has employed. Doctors have suggested putting her on a ventilator along with other treatments you feel are unnecessary, so you decline. Shortly after, you're told you'll actually be unable to stay with your child, even though she's not fully capable of making medical decisions for herself. The doctor calls you the next day to give an update, explaining her vitals are stable and improving, so she'll likely go home soon. Tragically and unexpectedly, hours later, she passes away. A year goes by, and you receive the medical records from your daughter's hospital stay. It shows a do not resuscitate order was placed, listing Down syndrome as the reason for this. This story is the heartbreaking reality for Scott Scara and his daughter Grace. For centuries, doctors have taken the Hippocratic Oath, written by Hippocrates, who's also known as the father of modern medicine, ensuring patients are treated with the highest level of care. Hippocrates wrote, "Into whatever house I enter, I will go into them for the benefit of the sick, and abstain from every voluntary act of mischief and corruption." Though the oath is still taken by doctors today, it's clear it's not as respected as it used to be. Not only have decisions like Roe v. Wade been upheld in America, but physicians have even revised the Hippocratic Oath to make abortion and physician-assisted suicide seemingly ethical. It's clear that some physicians don't see life as valuable as they used to based on these changes. This is due to God being pushed out of society. The Bible teaches that all people are created in the image of God. However, because people have never been exposed to this truth, the idea that the unborn, those with disabilities, or those with a terminal illness are inferior has become increasingly accepted. Before I continue, it's important to point out that I'm not saying all medical professionals are waiting for an opportunity to harm their patients in some way. After high school, I even plan on going into the medical field as an occupational therapist. There are many truly amazing doctors that advocate for the autonomy of their patients, and as a society, I believe we should be grateful for modern medicine and the lives that have been saved from it. However, because their jobs are so crucial, it's important to realize that there has been a change in the way some doctors care for their patients, and if overlooked, the problem will only continue to get bigger. To understand why some medical professionals have an altered view of humanity, it's important to learn what a secular worldview defines as human. The personhood theory offers clarity into their beliefs. The personhood theory, according to Nancy Pearcey, explains that a person is typically defined in terms of a certain level of cognitive function, consciousness, and self-awareness. This theory separates the concept of human and person. All people are objectively human, however, qualifying as a person is subjective and based on what society deems as valuable. With these ideas in mind, it's no surprise doctors can write off certain people as less than. Separating these concepts makes it easy to abort or mistreat patients if they're just a clump of cells with no feelings that add no value to society, as is often argued by those who support these life-ending procedures. It makes it seem as though a doctor is simply putting the end to the struggle of a helpless creature. However, this is not the case. Understanding the value of human life is fundamental to society. In the current world, a number of people have rushed to support the devaluing of human life due to the way it's presented by those in powerful positions, such as politicians. The author Nancy Pearcey explains the ideas best when she states, "Killing is wrong only in cases of someone who's cognitively developed enough to harbor an explicit, conscious desire to live." These thoughts lead to a slippery slope of making murder an action of mercy. It's also important to remember the constitutional right that people have to life. We'll discuss these two ideas in more detail later in this speech. What can be done about these issues? It's clear that both children and adults are dying at the hands of those who claim to be there to help them, but it can be hard to see the impact regular citizens can have in preventing these practices from taking place. However, there are certainly ways in which Christians can make an impact. One of these is by fulfilling the Great Commission. Jesus told his disciples to therefore go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Unfortunately, many doctors that perform life-ending procedures have never heard the value that God places on life. By sharing the gospel, more people in the healthcare system will be aware of how valuable humans actually are. As a biblical worldview has been replaced with a secular one, some healthcare professionals have increasingly expressed a disregard for human life as made in the image of God. In this speech, I'll explore the way human life has been regarded in medicine throughout history and what caused it to change, how insurance companies, laws, and incentivized healthcare have supported the change, and the effects seen in society as a result. The changing of the Hippocratic Oath throughout history has left the value of human life open to the interpretation of the physician. It's clear that humans have had value since the beginning of the world. Christians have a great understanding of this value from the creation account. In the book of Genesis, God says, "Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let him have dominion over all the earth." So God created man in the image of God. In the image of God, he created him. From the beginning, humans were set apart from the rest of creation. Notice God repeats the fact that we're created in his image 3 times to underscore its significance. We're all given free will, the ability to think for ourselves, and a conscience to tell us right from wrong, all of which make us different from animals and other things that were also designed at creation. These facts translate directly into the medical field. When looking at the history of medicine, it's clear that Hippocrates also held these beliefs. Many people have probably heard his name before in our current society where medical ethics have been called into question. Hippocrates was alive around 400 BC. During this period in ancient Greece, many believed that religious superstitions were correlated to one's health. If a person were ill, they were being cursed by the gods. Hippocrates denied claims like these and instead used the scientific method to find treatments for illnesses. While it's unclear if Hippocrates wrote it himself, it was ultimately his actions that inspired the Hippocratic Oath. In this oath, the standard for patient care is clearly laid out. It states, "I will give no deadly medicine to anyone if asked, nor suggest any such counsel, and I will not give a woman a pessary to produce an abortion." Hippocrates understood the value of human life and the critical role physicians play in treating those who are ill. With this oath, Hippocrates and those who contributed sought to ensure the rights of patients were preserved, and they were given the best treatment options possible. This oath was taken by doctors for centuries. However, in recent years, a revised version of the oath is upheld. A revised version of the oath is upheld, and doctors continue to publish new versions that have completely different guidelines than those laid out previously. A revision of the oath was first published in 1948. As reported by Sharon Clark, the National Institutes of Health cites the reason for this change is to, quote, "better serve the present-day needs and current ethics of physicians." It's important to realize the changes made took the requirements to not cause abortion or assist a person in death out of the oath. Society is attempting and been somewhat successful at making these actions acceptable. Other physicians have attempted to change the oath even further. Louis Weinstein, an infectious disease specialist, wrote in his revision, "I shall always have the highest respect for human life, and remember it's wrong to terminate life in certain circumstances, permissible in some, and acts of charity in others." Neglecting the value of human life pushes God out of society, as he's the one who set us apart from the beginning. The changes in the healthcare system that will be discussed in the rest of this thesis are a result of this. The devaluing of human life has also been carried out in our current society by means of legislation or incentivized healthcare and legislation that promote it. Unfortunately, while many doctors are truly concerned for their patients and have their best interests at heart, other factors such as political power and money have seeped into the industry, affecting the care that patients receive. An interview I conducted with Dr. Donald Friedman, who has been a certified OBGYN for 46 years, sheds light on the role insurance companies have had in this change. He explains, prior to the 1980s, insurance was a method by which most could afford care. When money was made the priority, once insurance companies began to realize they controlled medical dollars, that's when they began to say who, what, when, where, and how medicine could be given. Doctors used to be able to prescribe whatever treatment they thought was necessary with no pushback from insurance companies. When money was made the priority, insurance companies started to deny treatments doctors suggested. This means they had to treat patients according to what insurance providers who've never met or examined the patient and have little medical knowledge thought was necessary. The control insurance companies have over money has also proven to influence the motives doctors and hospitals have behind recommending certain treatments or medications. A document entitled COVID-19 Vaccine Incentive Program by Anthem Blue Cross and Blue Shield Insurance Company lays this out pretty clear. In it, the document explains that if a hospital gets a certain number of people vaccinated by a certain date, the hospital will make more money per shot. It doesn't matter if the person will benefit from the shot or not. Unfortunately, insurance companies are more concerned with the money they stand to lose or gain than the comfort or care their patients receive when their health is fragile. In addition to incentives, there has also been legislation put in place that demonstrate a disregard for human life. During his time in office, Barack Obama implemented Obamacare, a system designed to make healthcare more affordable. From 2009 to 2011, Ezekiel Emanuel served as the special advisor on health policy and helped draft the Affordable Care Act. Emanuel is very open about the way he views human life, saying things like, healthcare services provided to individuals who are irreversibly prevented or becoming participating citizens are not basic and should not be guaranteed. What gives this man the power to decide which lives are valuable? The Constitution of the United States gives all people the right to life. Therefore, all people, no matter the ability, have the right to life-saving or sustaining care. Based on this way of thinking, it's no surprise that certain sections of Obamacare exist. In Section 1553, it states, in Section 1553, it states, the federal government or any state or local government or healthcare provider that receives federal financial assistance under this act, or any healthcare plan created under this act, may not discriminate against an individual or institutional healthcare entity because the entity does not provide any healthcare item or service that causes or assists in causing the death of any individual, such as by assisted suicide, euthanasia, or mercy killing. Remember the story of Grace Scarra that I began this speech with? It's legislation like this that makes what happened to her acceptable. This loophole made it lawful to not provide Grace with the health care she needed, thus resulting in her death. Remember, Hippocrates revolutionized medicine by rejecting the idea that the people who were ill were cursed. Instead, he cared for people who would have been shunned in society. However, changing the oath has sent society backward. These marginalized patients are synonymous with the cursed patients of Hippocrates' era. The value of human life was replaced with money and power, leading to a corrupt system. The culmination of all these issues we've discussed has ultimately led to doctors playing God. This is seen tangibly in actions like abortion, euthanasia, and unequal care for people with disabilities. In order to see this, it's important to look at each issue individually. Abortion has become widely accepted in our culture. In 1973, the Supreme Court ruled to protect the nation's right to abortion. In his article, Upholding the Sanctity of Life in a Culture of Death, Richard Weikar, a professor of history at California State University, explains the results of these actions. He writes, over 58 million babies have died from abortion since Roe v. Wade in 1973. In 2010 to 2014, the annual international rate was 56 million abortions per year. And since 1973, there have been far more than 1 billion abortions in the world. Oftentimes, families with babies who are deemed incompatible with life in the womb are only given the option to abort the child. The child will only live for a few hours or a few days, so why bring it into the world in the first place is often the reasoning for this. However, this way of thinking is flawed. Many families have shared their testimony when going through a tragedy such as this. David and Kelly Crawford are an example. The young couple was expecting their first child when routine genetic testing revealed the baby had a life-limiting medical condition. They were told to abort the child. However, instead, they chose life for the baby. Kelly explains she received comfort and joy in the midst of tragedy by being able to meet for and care for her son. This makes sense, as God designed women with a maternal instinct that's ultimately ignored when abortion is done, thus going against God's perfect plan. The impact of this decision was so great for the Crawford family, they went on to create Able Speaks, which is an organization named after their son that supports families who've chosen life for their child after a life-limiting diagnosis. Another way in which doctors play God in our current medical system is physician-assisted death. In a study that surveyed doctors about the use of physician-assisted suicide, it was reported that 11% of physicians said under current legal constraints, there were circumstances in which they would be willing to hasten a patient's death by prescribing medication, and 7% said they would do so if it were legal. 36% and 24% respectively, 7% said they would provide a lethal injection. 36% and 24% respectively said they would do so if it were legal. Many physicians view aiding someone in death as an act of mercy. However, not only could these actions normalize death in society, but it also leaves a lot of gray area. Who defines suffering and when it's too much to bear? The Bible offers clarity into this issue. Job was a man in the Bible that was faced with much suffering. He was not only stripped of all his physical belongings and wealth, but also his physical health. In the second chapter of Job, it states, so Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. What Job was going through was extremely painful and miserable, yet he didn't try to remove his suffering by taking his life. As Christians, we know God works all things for good, including suffering. Romans helps us understand why when it states, not only this, but we rejoice in our suffering, knowing that suffering produces endurance. Job trusted God's plan for his life, and God used his suffering to not only strengthen his faith, but be an example to others of what unwavering faith looks like. If Job had ended his life, this wouldn't have happened. The last area that needs to be discussed is unequal treatment people with disabilities face in the medical field. There are many accounts from families of those with disabilities claiming their loved one did not receive adequate care, especially during the COVID-19 pandemic. In an article from The Guardian that discussed the tragic story of Susan Sullivan, who, like Grace, was a woman with Down syndrome who died from COVID, the gravity of the situation is better explained. The author writes, last year, a report by the Learning Disability Mortalities Review Program found that almost half of those who died from COVID did not receive good enough treatment, including problems accessing care. Of those who died from COVID-19, 81% had a do not resuscitate decision placed. When God is pushed out of medical care, some people are seen as more significant than others due to factors they cannot control. God is the only giver and taker of life. When it comes to medical treatments like abortion or assisted suicide, many argue the patient's right to bodily autonomy as a justification. This is more commonly presented in society today as the my body, my choice argument. While this argument seems reasonable at first, it definitely has its flaws. First, when it comes to the issue of abortion, there's more than one body involved. Abortion neglects the autonomy of the baby completely. The personhood theory explained throughout this speech is used by the opposing side to deny that the baby is a person. However, this is not true. Babies can survive out of the womb as early as 22 weeks, and if left to develop, no matter how far along, a baby will be born. I was able to talk about this issue in my interview with Dr. Friedman. When asked about his stance on the issue, he replied, "From a medical perspective, there are two lives. Doctors try to protect both." It's also important to remember that actions have consequences. Irresponsible actions with known repercussions should not result in a baby losing their life. When it comes to assisted suicide, we must remember that according to Scripture, assisted suicide is murder. Nothing justifies taking the life of another human being. In his article, The Common Good, Terminal Illness, and Euthanasia, Charles J. Daugherty, former president of Duquesne University, offers alternatives to assisted suicide. He writes, patients with do not resuscitate orders should not be kept in ICU beds, where dying is prolonged, expenses multiply, and loved ones are held at arm's length. When do not resuscitate orders are written, patients should be sent home for hospice care. Hospice care allows patients who are nearing the end of their lives to pass away peacefully or to be comfortable and pass away peacefully, oftentimes surrounded by loved ones, without using another human. In addition, the Bible is clear with the commandment, "Thou shalt not murder." Even if a patient requests assisted suicide, it would be unethical for the physician to provide it. Though the other side can seem valid, to the Christian it's clear this way of thinking is incorrect. The value of human lives have been neglected in our society due to a rejection of a biblical worldview. In this thesis, we've discussed the important role God plays in the healthcare system. We've explored the history behind Hippocrates, his ideas, and how he helped inspire the Hippocratic Oath. We saw that society moving away from God called the oath into revision due to anti-abortion and euthanasia requirements found in it. These changes resulted in a culture with incentivized healthcare. The amount of money a hospital stands to lose or make now plays an unfortunate role in deciding a patient's outcome. In addition, there have been healthcare reforms put in place, like Obamacare, that protect physicians who deny patients life-saving treatment based on qualities they cannot control. The effects of these changes are seen throughout the healthcare system. Abortion rates are higher, euthanasia rates are higher, and the lives of those with disabilities are seen as inferior. These issues cannot be ignored. They're a matter of life and death. If society continues on this path, death will be normalized, resulting in a callous population. The question is, however, what can we do as middle schoolers, high schoolers, or adults with no ties to the medical field? However, there are a few areas in which Christians have a responsibility to voice their opinions. Christians should be aware of what the Bible says in order to spot where injustices occur. For older listeners, we can use our political stewardship in the upcoming election by voting for the candidates that views promote the sanctity of life. Lastly, we should advocate for the least of these and stand up for those who have potential to fall victim to the corruption in the system. Advocate for yourselves and family members when health problems arise, and don't allow yourself to be pressured into taking medication or receiving treatments you don't feel comfortable with. Allowing the medical field to continue in this manner will have detrimental and far-reaching consequences. Thank you. Terrible. Any questions? Questions? Bryson?
What would you say to somebody who's thinking of assisted suicide?
So the question is, what would I say to someone who's thinking of assisted suicide? So my thesis is kind of more on the realms of like why doctors shouldn't do it, but I would definitely just go to Scripture, remind them of truth, remind them that they're loved by God, they're loved by all their family members that are around them, that kind of thing. So yeah. Well.
What are some other practical steps we can take in changing the system for the better?
Okay, so the question is, what are some other practical things we could do to change the system for the better? So kind of like I addressed in my speech, we should definitely be like better advocates for ourselves. I think a lot of times people, like with vaccinations, for example, we just go to our checkups and they're like, oh, you have this vaccine due, and we just take it because we haven't done research. So I think informing yourself about different medications and treatments is definitely a good step. Anybody else? Oh.
Are there any direct verses towards suicide or any type of murder?
So are there any, the question is there any like verses that talk about assisted suicide?
Yes, and like how God tells us about it.
So, okay. Probably what I mentioned, thou shalt not murder, is assisted suicide is murder. It's another person is involved in the act of someone else dying. So that qualifies as murder. So like I said in my thesis, thou shalt not murder is definitely one of the 10 Commandments, probably a good verse to refer to. Any other questions? We good? All right, I'm done.